So far, we've looked at how we can write server code in JavaScript using Express to make endpoints. And then we've also looked at how to write web pages with HTML and CSS. In this video, we're finally going to bring these two different tracks together and find out how first we can use Express to serve our HTML and CSS content, but then also we're going to look at another application of JavaScript. We'll see how we can attach JavaScript files to an HTML web page, and then look at a couple common functions that exist in the browser. These functions will allow us to do things like create new elements for our web page purely out of JavaScript, style those elements, and even have them respond to actions that the user performs. This will enable us to create websites that are a little bit more immersive, that do more than just serve content and actually interact. That said, let us begin. So I have here a starter project with all of our code from our last video. As a quick refresher, this code creates an Express app. We had served a couple furniture endpoints with our RESTful design. And then we actually launched this app to listen on port 1234. I've also created a second folder here called client. And in there, I've just got a basic HTML web page with a body that has a header for our web page and then a section with some inventory. Finally, I've got some styles attached to this web page. Here in style CSS, just some basic formatting so that it's at least legible when we open up this web page. Now, my first question for myself is, how do I actually make it so that when I run this Express app, I can see these HTML and CSS files? And the way that we do that with Express is very similar to how we serve other endpoints. Every time we wanted to create a new URL that users could navigate to, we had to use app.use. And the same is going to be true here. If I want to serve some other directory, I tell my Express app to use the Express static middleware. And this is just a special function that Express exposes that allows us to specify some path that has files that should be served as is. Unlike our router, which we needed to import and we needed to write more JavaScript code for, with this client folder, I've told Express, take anything in there, and when someone asks for a matching file, go and give it to them as plain text. So if we want to serve our client-side code, all we have to do is add this one extra line and we'll be good to go. So now, if I go and open up my terminal and I run main.js, just like last time, it starts listening on 1234. And then if I come over to a browser, I now have a web page that is served here. This web page has all of that HTML. If I open up the inspector, we can see all of that content got served precisely as is. So that's great. That's already given us the ability to make websites that have both an API and some static content. But what I want to do now is look at how we can start creating code that manipulates this web page after it is first served. So you might remember when we are dealing with an HTML web page, there are two major sections, two tags that have to happen right inside HTML. The body, that's got everything the web page will render, and the head, that is the place for all of the metadata, all of the stuff that helps the browser know what to do when it serves this web page. One of the big things that was included up here was links to other styling rules. Very similarly, in the head, we can put a script tag that has information about JavaScript code that should run right when this page loads. So it is possible to put JavaScript right here between the tag, but much more often what we do is we link out to a second page. This helps us stay a little bit more organized and doesn't pollute this file with content with code as well. So I'm going to make a JavaScript folder for myself. I like breaking it up so that my client has all the styles in one place, the code in another place, and I'm going to call this thing just client.js. Here in my HTML page, I can say I want to load the JavaScript client.js file. And if I do that, then I now have this launching point, this entry point where I can run JavaScript. I could go here and say console log, hello browser. And if I do that, when my web page runs, if I go and hop over to my browser, in the console, we can actually see that hello browser. We even see it happened because of client.js line 2. This script file is now attached to my web page and it runs immediately right when the web page is first navigated to. So that doesn't seem super useful on its own. Not too many people open up the console and see what's printed out down there. What it is that makes JavaScript in the browser so powerful is that we actually get a couple extra functions available to us when we are running JavaScript in a web context. So all of these functions that I'm going to tell you about today live on one variable that just exists in web pages, and that is this document variable here. So this document object has dozens, hundreds of properties that allow you to do many different things that are relevant for a web page that might not make sense when we're talking about servers. So these things do come at a cost, which is that we get all these extra web functions, but in turn, we don't get access to some of the powerful operating system features that we did back in our server code. In the browser, you can't do something like randomly open up a file from someone's computer, because that would be a little bit risky. If I could just, anytime anyone visited my website, just take a peek and see, is there a desktop/passwords.txt? If so, send that to me on the server. That's risky, and so the browsers disallow any reaching out of the little sandbox that they've created for you. But in turn, they give you things like this document object that enable us to do a lot to our web pages. The first thing that I want to show you is we can use this document API to fetch out individual elements from our page. I can say, I want that body tag from our HTML, and I want to be able to look at that thing here in my JavaScript. To do that, I can grab the document.body, and this will give me back an HTML element. This HTML element has functions on it, and it has attributes on it that allow us to manipulate it, change it, add things to it. And the neat thing is, we're not just limited to elements that are already on the page. If I wanted to create something brand new from scratch, I can even do that using the document object. Let's say I am making my little inventory site and I want a button that can load the inventory. This load button, I can make one by saying document, go ahead and create an element. And in here, inside the parameters, I just say what type of HTML element this is. In our case, I'm going to create a button. Once I have this button, it works like any other HTML element, works like any other JavaScript object. I can use it, put a dot, and then access the various features of it. One of the big ones with elements is that they have an inner HTML and an inner text that allows us to decide what belongs inside of this thing in our HTML page. So I might say my load button has the text load inventory. Maybe I decide my load button. I also want to manipulate the styles, make the text of the button white. Maybe also make the background color a little bit prettier. We'll make it a nice dark gray. How about about 0 hue, 0 saturation, 40% lightness should do it. Also going to maybe give it a little bit of padding. And you might notice every time I write one of these style attributes on this button, this looks very familiar. These are all CSS declarations, and any CSS declaration that you're able to write in a CSS file, you can also write right here in your JavaScript code. Sometimes things get remapped a little bit. Most will be exactly the same name. Border will still be border, color will still be color. The values always have to be strings of text because a lot of CSS rules have special formatting that you couldn't really represent numerically. Even the word white doesn't make sense as anything but text. But even when you have a pure number like the number 0, that should be assigned to one of these style attributes as text because that's the format JavaScript is expecting it in. When we do have a property that has 2 words like border radius, in CSS, often we put a dash between these things. In JavaScript, those same properties usually have a camel case name, lowercase first word, and then uppercase for every other word coming after. That is one thing to keep in mind, that it's not always a one-to-one mapping, that minus means something very different in JavaScript, so they had to cheat some of the names. But here now we've got a bunch of styling on our button, and I might want to go check, what does this thing look at like in my web page? And with what I've got right now, I am creating this element, I am styling it. So I hop on over to my app that I've created, and when I refresh, that button's still not here. If I go and I look in the inspector, it's not even added to this page anywhere. I can't see it. And that is because in our JavaScript file, it's not enough to create this thing. I also need to tell JavaScript where it belongs in the original document. That there's nothing that specifies, hey, does that button belong here or there or there? JavaScript hates guessing, so we need to do that work for it. If I want to add something to the page, first I need to know about something else that's already on the page. Luckily for us, we already have an example of that. Our body is a part of our web page. It is represented in our HTML. So I can say, hey, body tag, I want you to append a child. I want something to be inside of the body tag. However, even this is not yet quite enough information. And the reason why is because of the order that code executes when we are loading a web page. So back here on our HTML file, this HTML file is actually read top to bottom by your browser. In the beginning, it's going to grab this style sheet, read the whole thing, put those rules in an object, and then it will read this whole script, look at all the rules, run the code, and only then will it get to the body and start creating all of these tags for itself. What that means is when this file runs, there isn't actually a body yet. That part hasn't been created by JavaScript. It's still up here in the head. If I want to reference my page inside my JavaScript code, there are two main ways we can do that. The cheater quick way that some people do is just take your script, drop it right on the bottom. There are even people who prefer this because it means all of your content will be loaded before you even start trying to read the file. But what I'm going to do is use one more function that's available to us on the document object. On the document object, there is a special function called add event listener. And this function actually exists on pretty much every browser specific thing in JavaScript. What this function says is, I want to listen for something that happens. And when that happens, there's some code I want to run. In this case, what we're going to listen for is once all the DOM content is loaded. DOM content refers to the document object model. That is just JavaScript's view of what all the HTML looks like. Once all the HTML is loaded, then there's something I want to do. And as you might have already guessed, whenever there's an event and then something that happens in response, that's going to be asynchronous. It's going to be one of our callback functions here. Then we're going to say only once the page is loaded, then I want to do all of this code. So if we do that and say, wait first, then try to attach our button, now we're finally ready to see our web page with our button. So if we head back over and refresh, suddenly there's a new thing that wasn't on this page before. There is our button that is styled gray with the white text and the border radius. In fact, if I open up the web dev console once more and go to the inspector, we can see the HTML of our web page has changed. There never was a button in the HTML file. If I switch back over, main is directly followed by the /body, but in our browser, there's suddenly this extra thing here, this button, and all of those style rules that we had declared are set right here directly inside the element's attributes. This is the power of JavaScript. After our web page was created, we've gone and created something brand new and snuck it into the HTML alongside everything else. So this is already really great. What I want to look at next is, I don't want that button to be way off on the right hand side of the page. I actually want to add it to this other element that already exists. So when I want to access an element that already exists, I can do so using one more document function, the document querySelector. So querySelector is a special function that for a long time was jQuery's claim to fame, that jQuery had figured this out. Finally, a couple decades ago, JavaScript made its own version of this querySelector. And what it allows us to do is put some CSS selector, that's where the selector in querySelector comes from, inside the arguments, and we'll get back the element that matches that query that we provide. So if I say I want the main tag right here inside the parentheses, what this will give me back is the main element of my web page, that existing tag that's already out there. It'll give me back nothing if nothing matches, but I can get as complex as I want here. I could say a body that has a main directly inside of it, that has a section directly inside of it, that is currently being hovered whatever I want to do, whatever combinators I want to apply, whatever IDs and classes you want to apply, you can do so right here inside this query selector. And there's also a query selector all if you're expecting more than one result. But this will give me a handle on an element that's already there on the web page. Once I have that, it works just like the body element we saw before. So I can take this main element, append my child to that main element. And if I do that, then when we pop back over to our web page, now when I refresh, the button is no longer at the very end. Instead, in our inspector, it's been added to that specific place I targeted. I said, find me a tag that is a main tag, and that's where I will attach my button. So this is much more often how we end up doing this type of DOM manipulation in JavaScript. We don't just go right to the document body. We have this laser precision where we ask for a very specific place, often identified with an ID, and then do all of our inserts right there. The one last thing that I do want to show you is that we can actually do even more with these functions. Many elements like buttons have some interactivity. They have some events that occur with respect to them. Just like we can tell a document that it should listen for something to occur, we can also tell our elements that they should listen for a particular event. In the case of my load button here, I am going to add an event listener, and the event that happens with a button is clicking. When someone clicks on the button, I can tell my browser JavaScript here, this is all of the code that I want you to run. Just like with DOMContentLoaded, we don't know when this is going to happen, so I need to make another callback function. And inside my callback function here, I could do whatever I wanted. I could do more DOM manipulation. Right now, just to prove that it works, I'm going to print out that the button was clicked. And if I do that, and then I pop back over to my web page one final time, make sure I refresh, then when I click this button, a new line appears on my console. Every time I click it, this little counter will go up of how many times I've printed out that identical line of output. But this is the crux of using JavaScript on the web in the browser. We find elements that exist on the HTML that has already been written. We attach some events to them, and then those events run the code. Very rarely does a JavaScript page do a million things right when it loads. Often these features rely on user input. So we have a very, very event-driven flavor to our programs where I am waiting for something and then I'm doing something in response. But hopefully this gives you just a taste of some of what we can do in a JavaScript file on an HTML page. We've looked at this document object, seen how we can use it to create brand new elements, how we can use it to find existing elements, and then how to attach elements to other elements. We've also seen how we can add events, both listening to the entire document or listening to things that occur on specific elements, and how we can restyle elements, apply styles after the page has loaded, maybe even in response to other events. In our next video, we'll look at how we can also wire in our APIs that we've created in Express. So I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.